Sign it, Claire. Stop embarrassing yourself. Daniel Whitmore slid the divorce papers across the gala table, his voice loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, his girlfriend's hand resting openly on his arm. In front of 400 guests, beneath the chandelier of the ballroom his foundation had rented. For the evening, he smiled like a man who had already won. He had no idea he was standing inside a building that belonged to his wife. If you've ever been underestimated by someone you gave everything to, stay with me until the end and drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. The invitation had read, "The Whitmore Heart Foundation Annual Gala, an evening of compassion, excellence, and vision." 500 engraved cards had gone out 6 weeks earlier, each one bearing the foundation's crest and Daniel Whitmore's name in raised gold lettering. The venue was the Grand Bennett Ballroom, the most prestigious event space in the city. The kind of place where senators shook hands with hospital executives and photographs ended up on the covers of philanthropic quarterly reports. The kind of place where reputations were made and destroyed. Claire Bennett Whitmore had dressed carefully that evening, not because she wanted to impress anyone, but because she had learned long ago that the way you appeared at the moment everything fell apart would be the image people remembered. She wore a deep navy gown, her dark hair pulled back simply, her only jewelry a single strand of her grandmother's pearls. She looked like exactly what she was, a woman from a quiet, serious family with serious money and absolutely nothing to prove. She had known what was coming, not the exact moment, not the precise choreography of Daniel's cruelty, but she had known that something was coming. Because Daniel had been pulling away for 8 months, and Claire had spent 7 of those months watching, listening, and preparing. Quietly, methodically, the way her mother had always taught her. A Bennett woman, her mother used to say, does not react. She responds, and only when she is ready. Claire was ready. She stood near the far edge of the main reception room, holding a glass of sparkling water. She never drank alcohol at events where she needed to think clearly, and watched Daniel work the room. He was extraordinary at it, she had to admit. Daniel Whitmore at a gala was like watching a surgeon in an operating theater, precise, confident, beautiful in his economy of movement. He moved from cluster to cluster of guests, his laugh warm and practiced, his handshake firm but never aggressive. The women found him charming. The men found him credible. The press found him photogenic. What none of them knew, what almost no one in that room knew, was that the version of Daniel Whitmore they were admiring had been built brick by brick, relationship by relationship, dollar by the quiet woman standing at the edge of the room with a glass of water. She watched him tuck his arm around the waist of Olivia Parker. Olivia was 31, tall, with the kind of beauty that required maintenance and announced itself the moment she entered a room. She worked in media relations, or had before Daniel began paying for her apartment in the Meridian building on the east side of town. She wore a red gown that evening, which struck Claire as either brave or deeply unaware. You did not wear red to a gala hosted by a woman whose family had funded half the tables. Claire had known about Olivia for 6 months. She had done nothing about it. Not yet. She watched Daniel lean down and say something in Olivia's ear, and Olivia laughed, and the laugh carried, and a few nearby guests glanced over with the polite, careful attention of people who sensed something happening but could not yet name it. Claire's attorney, Margaret Holt, appeared at her elbow. Margaret was 63, compact with silver hair and an expression that had never once in 30 years of a family law practice communicated anything she did not intend to communicate. She had been Claire's mother's attorney before she had been Claire's, and she was possibly the most unintimidatable woman Claire had ever met. "He's moving toward the stage," Margaret said very quietly. "I know," Claire said. "You want to intercept?" "No." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Then your cousin Richard is positioned near the donor registration table. Your CFO has the primary account documentation. The building manager has been briefed." "Good, and the board chair. He knows enough," Claire said. "He'll understand the rest when it happens." Margaret gave a small nod, the kind that meant understood, and also perhaps, "This is going to be extraordinarily unpleasant and I respect your composure." Then she moved back into the crowd with the practiced invisibility of someone who had spent decades being underestimated in expensive rooms. Claire turned back toward the stage. Daniel had taken the 3 steps up to the raised platform at the front of the ballroom. One of his staff, a young man named Bryce, who was 26 and entirely devoted to Daniel's image, handed him a microphone. The room began to settle, conversations softened, glasses paused midway to mouths. This was the part of the evening everyone expected, Daniel's speech. His yearly address to the Foundation's donors, full of statistics about children's cardiac outcomes and moving personal stories about patience and gratitude for everyone in the room. He gave it beautifully every year. Claire had helped him write every single one of them. She had not helped him write this year's. Friends, Daniel said, his voice warm and projecting effortlessly into the room. Thank you all for being here tonight. 12 years. 12 years of this foundation, this work, this extraordinary community of people who believe that a child's heart is worth fighting for. Applause, genuine and warm, because the Foundation's work was real and the outcomes were real, and whatever else Daniel Whitmore was, he was an excellent surgeon who had saved a great number of lives. Claire clapped too briefly. I want to say something personal tonight, Daniel continued, and something in his tone shifted just a degree, just enough for the people closest to the stage to notice that this was no longer the standard speech. Something that I think many of you already sense, because you're perceptive people and you've known me for years. He paused, the room waited. My marriage, he said, has come to an end. A murmur moved through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Claire and I have been living separately for several months. I think it's time to be honest about that, rather than maintain a performance that serves no one. He looked directly at Claire across the room, and his expression was, she thought, the most calculated thing she had ever seen from him, designed to look sincere, designed to look like a man making a difficult and brave announcement, designed to look like the aggrieved adult party. In the spirit of honesty, he said, and in recognition of the fact that we are surrounded by people who deserve the truth, I've asked for a divorce. He reached inside his jacket and he withdrew a sealed envelope. I had hoped to handle this privately, he said, his voice just slightly roughened, as if emotion was costing him something. But Claire has made that impossible. So I'm doing what I've always done, being transparent with the people who matter. He extended the envelope toward the edge of the stage. Bryce, the young staff member, walked it across the room toward Claire. 437 people watched. Claire took the envelope from Bryce's hands. She noted that Bryce's own hands were shaking slightly. She felt a brief flicker of sympathy. For him, he was young and he had no idea what he was in the middle of, and then she turned her attention to the envelope. She opened it. The documents were what she expected. Divorce petition filed in the name of Daniel Arthur Whitmore, citing irreconcilable differences. A proposed settlement framework attached 47 pages that she recognized immediately as the work of Garrison Legal Group, the firm Daniel had hired 8 weeks ago, apparently believing she wouldn't find out. The framework was aggressive. It assigned to Daniel primary ownership and management authority over the Whitmore Heart Foundation, the primary residence on Ashworth Lane, the vacation property in Maine, and a portfolio of investments Claire had personally structured over the course of their marriage. It was, she thought, almost impressively audacious. She looked up from the documents. Daniel was watching her from the stage with an expression she recognized, the braced, prepared look of a man who expects an explosion and has decided to welcome it because a public scene would serve his narrative. She knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted her to cry or shout or storm toward him with the papers in her shaking hand. He wanted the room to see a woman who had lost control, who was emotional, who was irrational. He wanted Olivia Parker's hand in his to look like relief, like the reasonable man finally freed from a difficult wife. Claire set the envelope down on the cocktail table beside her. She picked up her glass of sparkling water. She took a small, unhurried sip. And then she looked at him with an expression that gave him nothing at all. For the first time that evening, something moved across Daniel's face that was not performance. It was uncertainty. Because he had expected an explosion, and he had not gotten one, and he was experienced enough to know that silence from Claire Bennett was never what it appeared to be. Is that it? Called a voice. From the crowd, a man named Gerald Foss, a cardiologist colleague of Daniel's, who had apparently had several drinks and possessed the social awareness of a golden retriever. That's all you're going to do, Danny? Hand her papers at the Gala. Uncomfortable laughter quickly suppressed. Daniel kept his composure. Gerald, I think it's poor form. Gerald said, not quite loudly, but not quietly either. I think this is very poor form. This is a personal matter between... You made it a room matter, said a woman's voice, quieter but carrying. Helen Argent, the Foundation's longest tenured board member, 71 years old, and possessed of the particular moral authority of someone who had seen everything twice. She was not looking at Daniel, she was looking at Claire. And her expression was not pity. It was something older and more complex than pity. It was recognition. Claire noticed this. She also noticed the shift in the room, the degree to which the murmur had changed character. It had started as the murmur of surprise. It was becoming the murmur of discomfort, of collective social conscience reasserting itself. Daniel felt it too. She could see him recalibrating. "I understand this is surprising," he said, smoothly pivoting. "And I want to be clear, this is not about drama. This is about honesty, about not pretending. The Foundation's work will continue. Nothing about that changes." "That's very confident," said a voice. And this time it was Margaret Holt's, clear and precise, not loud but somehow filling the space available to it. "Given that you don't control the Foundation." Daniel's eyes found Margaret. "Miss Holt, I didn't realize." "You rarely do," Margaret said pleasantly. There was a brief, arrested silence. Daniel looked at Claire. Claire looked back at him. And then she did something she had not planned to do. She had not planned most of the specifics of the evening, only the architecture. She smiled. Not a triumphant smile, not a cold, calm one. The smile of a woman who had been waiting for a long time and had finally arrived somewhere she intended to be. She reached into the small clutch she carried and withdrew a single card, which she handed to a nearby server with a quiet word. The server crossed the room, stepped up to the stage, and handed the card to Daniel. Daniel looked at it. The card bore 3 lines of text. "The Grand Bennett Ballroom. Property of the Bennett Family Trust. Managed exclusively by the Bennett Family Trust since 1987. It took him a moment. She watched him read it twice. She watched the specific, particular moment when he understood. His face did not collapse. He was too practiced for that. But something in him, some physical understanding of the ground beneath him shifted, and she saw it in the slight adjustment of his posture, the microscopic tightening around his eyes. He had been standing in her ballroom. He had handed her divorce papers inside her building. He had declared that he would take the Foundation's primary assets in a room that had belonged to her family for 13 years, surrounded Danny Dogers, whose relationships with the Mintax Niesmal predated his existence in their world by decades. Daniel lowered the card. He looked at her. She held his gaze for exactly 3 seconds, then looked away as if he had become unimportant. The next 40 minutes were extraordinary in the specific way that very contained, very controlled disasters are extraordinary. No one screamed, no one threw anything. The evening did not descend into chaos. But the knowledge moved through the room the way water moves through limestone, finding every crack, working its way through every seam, reaching every corner. Word traveled from table to table. The Bennett Ballroom, the building itself, the Foundation's primary event venue for the last 11 years, the place Daniel had proudly used as the centerpiece image in the Foundation's annual report. It belonged to his wife's family trust, had always belonged to her family's trust. Daniel had been renting it every year at a nominally reduced rate as a courtesy extended to him by the Bennett family on the understanding, unspoken but not unreal, that the relationship was maintained in good faith. Helen Argent sought Claire out near the far side of the room. "How much does he know?" Helen asked without preamble. "About the properties, probably most of it now," Claire said. "About the donor relationships, less. About the trust structure itself, very little. He believed he understood the arrangement. He was wrong about the nature of what he understood. The Kaufman donation," Helen said. "The Albrecht family commitment. The Meridian Health Partnership. All originated through Bennett family connections," Claire said. "All documented." Helen was quiet for a moment. "Then he's going to say you're retaliating." "He's going to say a lot of things, are you?" Claire thought about this honestly. "No," she said, "I'm not retaliating. Retaliation would require me to take something that was his. I'm just stopping pretending that things were his when they weren't." Helen studied her for a moment, with the focused attention of a woman who had spent 50 years in rooms where the truth mattered and knew how to find it. Then she nodded once, and the nod meant something. Across the room, Claire could see Daniel in intense, low-voiced conversation with his attorney, a man named Porter, from Garrison Legal, who had arrived at some point in the last 30 minutes and was now looking at his phone with an expression that communicated the specific distress of a lawyer who has just learned that his client's case is significantly more complicated than he had been told. Olivia Parker had moved away from Daniel's side. She was standing near the bar, holding a glass of champagne she was not drinking. And her expressions was the expression of a woman who had arrived at a party, expecting one kind of evening, and was now recalibrating in real time. Claire noticed all of this. She also noticed Richard Bennett, her first cousin, moving quietly through the room. Richard was 44, ran the family's primary holding company, and had the kind of face that could sit in any room in the world and be read as nothing more than a pleasant, attentive businessman. He caught Claire's eye across the space. She gave him the smallest nod. He moved toward the donor registration table. This was important. This was in many ways more important than anything visible in the room, because the donor list was the foundation's circulatory system, and the relationships on that list had been built, tended, and maintained for a decade by Claire through thank you calls and birthday cards, and remembered preferences and genuine, attentive care for the causes that each donor actually believed in. She knew which families gave because they had lost a child to cardiac disease. She knew which executives gave because it connected them to a community they respected. She knew which philanthropists gave because the foundation's outcomes data was legitimate, and they were serious people who demanded legitimate outcomes. Daniel knew their names. Claire knew their hearts. There was a difference. Porter, Daniel's attorney, broke away from his client and crossed the room toward Claire. Mrs. Whitmore. He was making an effort at composure that Claire found almost sympathetic. I think under the circumstances it might be productive to have a preliminary conversation. Mr. Porter, Margaret Holt said, appearing at Claire's elbow with the quiet precision of a woman who had spent 40 years perfecting her timing. My client will be available through proper channels. This is not those channels, of course. Porter looked between them. I just want to, there may have been some information that wasn't fully communicated to our side. There was quite a lot of information that wasn't fully communicated to your side. Margaret agreed pleasantly. That's something we will discuss at the appropriate time and in the appropriate setting. Not here, Porter retreated. The evening moved forward. Dinner was served because the caterers had a contract and the servers had their instructions, and the event had a momentum of its own that could not simply be stopped because a marriage was dissolving at table 6. There was a program remarks from a young patient's family, a presentation of this year's surgical outcomes, an auction for a series of artwork donated by foundation supporters. Claire sat through all of it. She ate her dinner. She spoke to the guest at her table, a retired surgeon and a wife, a foundation donor who ran a regional hospital network, a couple she had known for 8 years whose youngest daughter had received cardiac surgery funded in part by the foundation when she was 4 years old. That little girl is 9 now, the mother said at one point, looking across the room to where her daughter sat at the children's table, animated and loud and entirely alive. I know, Claire said. I remember when you called me. You drove to the hospital, of course. The woman reached across the table and put her hand over Claire's. She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Across the room, Daniel watched this exchange. Claire did not look at him. What happened next, what was happening, even as dinner was served, and programs were conducted, was quieter and more consequential than anything visible in the room. It was happening in phone calls made in the corridor outside the ballroom, in text message exchanges between board members, in the quiet conference between Richard Bennett and the Foundation's CFO in a small anteroom off the main hall. It was happening in the information now assembling itself into a coherent picture, expense reports reviewed, account transfers examined, a pattern emerging from the data like a shape appearing in static when you finally understood what you were looking at. The Foundation's accounts told a story. It was not a flattering story. Daniel had been using Foundation resources not massively, not brazenly, but consistently, across 18 months to fund elements of a lifestyle that bore no relation to charitable work. A trip to Monaco, documented as a donor cultivation visit that had included Olivia Parker under a name listed as development consultant. A series of dinners at restaurants whose per-plate costs exceeded what any reasonable business meal required. A conference in the south of France in September that corresponded precisely with dates Claire now recognized as the beginning of Olivia's public social media presence in Daniel's world. It wasn't embezzlement in the blunt, unmistakable sense. It was the subtler kind, the kind that required someone careful to look carefully. Claire had been careful. She had been looking. The Foundation's external auditor, a woman named Brennan from the firm of Tanner and Associates, who had been retained 6 weeks ago on Claire's quiet instruction, and Margaret's recommendation had compiled a preliminary report. The report was not yet public. It would become public at the appropriate time. But Margaret had a copy, and Richard had a copy, and the board chair, a man named Ellison who had helped build the Foundation's governance structure 12 years ago, was making his way through the evening with the deliberate, composed expression of a man who knew what he knew and was deciding what to do with it. He found Claire during the dessert course. "This is quite an evening," he said, pulling out the chair beside her. "Yes, he didn't tell me about the divorce. I'm said not." Ellison looked at his dessert plate for a moment. He was 68, had spent 30 years in nonprofit governance, and had the particular steadiness of someone who had seen organizational crises before and understood that the most important thing in a crisis was to know what the organization actually stood for. "The Foundation's mission is real," he said. "It's always been real," Claire said. "The children are real, the outcomes are real, none of that changes." "What changes? Who's in charge of it?" she said. Ellison was quiet for a moment. "Are you prepared for how difficult he's going to make this?" "Yes, he has allies, so do I," she said. "Better ones, I think, when all the information is available." Ellison looked at her for a moment, the considering look of a man taking the full measure of something he perhaps had not previously looked at directly. Then he said, "Your mother would be proud of you." Claire felt something move in her chest, not a collapse, not a breaking, but a brief, full acknowledgement of grief and love and everything the compliment contained. "Thank you," she said. "She taught me everything I know about this." What her mother had taught her, what Eleanor Bennett had spent 30 years teaching her daughter by demonstration. Not lecture, was that the most powerful position in any room was the one no one was watching. Eleanor had never wanted recognition, she had wanted outcomes. She had built her family's foundation connections, not for applause, but because she genuinely believed that the work mattered, and that the people doing it needed support, and that the support required care and patience and the willingness to be invisible while the work got done. Claire had watched her mother be invisible for decades. She had practiced it. She had become extraordinary at it. And tonight, in a room full of people who had believed for 12 years that the invisible woman beside Daniel Whitmore was simply Daniel Whitmore's wife, tonight was the night that began to change. The formal program concluded around 9:30. The auction ended. The last remarks were given. The orchestra, there was always an orchestra at the Whitmore Gala, began the evening's reception music, a signal that the event was transitioning from its formal structure to the looser social second half of the evening. Daniel found her. She had been expecting it. He came to her in the corner of the room, where she was finishing a conversation with the retired surgeon and his wife, and he waited, with a surface-level patience that she could read for what it was, until the conversation concluded and the surgeon and his wife moved away. Then he looked at her, and all the performance fell away, and what was underneath it was something that surprised her slightly in its directness. "What are you doing, Claire?" he said, not threatening, not aggressive, just genuinely wanting to know. "I'm attending my gala," she said. "Our gala, the Bennett family gala," she said, "which your foundation has used for 11 years as a courtesy to you." "That's not, that's not how I understood it." "I know you chose to understand it in the way that was most convenient," she said. "I know you stopped asking questions about the arrangements because you preferred not to know the answers. That's different from actually not knowing." Something crossed his face, frustration, and beneath it, something that might have been the beginning of a more honest reckoning with himself. She had loved him once. She wanted to be clear-eyed about that. She had loved him with the whole of herself, and she had believed in his work and his potential, and the version of their life together that had felt real and important for many of those 12 years. That love and those years were real. They did not disappear because of what came after, but they did not obligate her to continue pretending. "The settlement proposal," he said. "We can discuss it. There's room to negotiate. Your attorneys will be in contact with Margaret," she said. "That's how this is going to work, Claire." His voice dropped. "I know you're angry." "I'm not angry, Daniel. Then what are you?" She thought about this for a moment. She gave it the honest consideration it deserved, because she had always believed in honest answers to honest questions, even from people who had not been honest with her. "I'm done," she said. "I'm not angry, I'm not hurt, or I am, but it's not the dominant thing. I'm done pretending that the architecture of our life was something you built, when I'm the one who laid every foundation. I'm done being invisible in my own story." He looked at her. For a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw something in his face that was not calculation or performance, or the careful management of optics. She thought she saw the man she had married, briefly visible beneath everything that man had become. "I built something," he said quietly. "I built my career, my reputation." "Your surgical skill is your own," she said, and she meant it. "You're an extraordinary surgeon, Daniel. That's real, and it's yours. But the platform, the foundation, the connections, the donors, The public image, the access. I built that. My family built that, and we built it because we believed in the work. Not because we believed in you performing the work for an audience. He was silent. Go take care of your patients, she said. That you are genuinely good at. The rest is going to change. She turned away from him. She walked back toward the center of the room, toward the light and the music and the 437 people whose presence in that ballroom, she now understood with new clarity, meant something specific and important. Behind her, she heard Daniel say something to Bryce. She didn't catch it. She didn't need to. Ahead of her, Helen Argent caught her eye and gave her a nod. Richard Bennett, across the room, raised his glass slightly. Margaret Holt, positioned near the exit, tilted her head in the small, precise gesture that meant everything is in order. And somewhere in the room, the mother of a 9-year-old girl who was alive and loud and entirely healthy was telling someone the story of the woman who had driven to the hospital, who had remembered to call, who had always known her name. Claire walked forward. The chandelier above her cast its light on everything equally. The evening was not over. In fact, in every way that mattered, it was only beginning. The orchestra played on. That was the thing Claire would remember later, not the silence, not the tension, not the moment Daniel's face had shifted when he read the card she sent to the stage. What she would remember was the orchestra playing on, smooth and unhurried, as if the world had not just changed shape entirely, as if a marriage had not just been publicly dissolved in the middle of a charity event, as if the architecture of 12 years had not just begun quietly and irrevocably to come apart at the seams. She stood near the center of the room and let herself breathe. This was something Eleanor Bennett had taught her too, the discipline of breath. When everything is moving fast, her mother had said, you slow down. You breathe. You let other people make their mistakes while you stay still. Claire had thought as a young woman that this was simply her mother's temperament. She understood now that it was strategy, the most effective strategy she had ever learned. Across the room, Daniel had been pulled into a corner by Porter, his attorney, and the conversation between them had the compressed, intense quality of two men rapidly revising a plan. Claire watched without appearing to watch, which was a skill she had perfected over 12 years of attending events, where the information that mattered was always happening at the periphery. Porter was showing Daniel something on his phone. Daniel's jaw tightened. He looked up, found Claire in the room, looked away. Porter said something else. Daniel shook his head once sharply. Then he said something that made Porter close his eyes briefly in the manner of a professional who has just learned that his client has not been entirely forthcoming. Margaret appeared at Claire's side with a small cup of coffee black, the way Claire took it at this hour of night, and set it down on the nearby table. Porter just ran the property records, Margaret said quietly. How long did it take him? About 12 minutes from when you sent the card. A pause. He's thorough, I'll give him that. But he should have done it 6 weeks ago when he filed. He believed Daniel, Claire said. Most people do, Margaret said. Right up until they don't. The evening shifted now into its second phase, not the formal program, not the public spectacle of Daniel's announcement, but something more complex and in some ways more consequential, the social reckoning. The part of the evening where the room itself began to reorganize around the new information, where people who had spent 12 years calibrating their relationship to the Whitmores as a unit began, privately and then in pairs and then in small groups, to recalibrate. Helen Argent, the board's longest-serving member, had gathered 3 other board members near the far windows. Claire could not hear the conversation, but she had known these people long enough to read body language. And what the body language said was focused, serious, not panicking, but deeply engaged in a problem they had not previously known existed. Good, Claire thought. They needed to be engaged. The Kaufman family, Harold and Rosemary Kaufman, whose foundation had contributed $3 million to the Whitmore Heart Foundation over this past 7 years, found Claire near the bar. Harold was 72 and had the directness of a man who had built 2 companies from nothing and respected directness in others. He put out his hand, shook hers firmly, and then held on for a moment. Tell me what I need to know, he said. The foundation's work is legitimate, Claire said. Every surgery, every outcome, every program in the field, all legitimate, all documented. And the governance, there are questions, she said. The board is aware. The board is addressing them. The counts, she met his eyes, being reviewed. Harold held her gaze for 3 seconds, reading her the way a man who had run serious organizations read serious people. Then he nodded once. Your mother funded the Kaufman pediatric wing, he said. I know, she called my wife personally when our grandson was born. She remembered his name when she saw us 3 years later. She kept notes, Claire said. She believed people deserved to be remembered. Like mother, Harold said, like daughter. He released her hand. Let me know what you need from us and when. Rosemary Kaufman, who had been standing slightly behind her husband and observing Claire with the careful, complete attention of a woman who had spent 50 years understanding people, leaned in and touched Claire's arm. Are you all right? She asked quietly, just that. Not performance, not drama, just the question. Claire felt the simplicity of it land in her chest. Yes, she said, and then more honestly, I will be. Rosemary nodded, and her nod meant something too, the nod of a woman who had weathered her own version of standing in a difficult room and knowing she was the only one who fully understood what was in it. Daniel had watched this exchange. She knew because when she glanced up, he was looking at her from across the room, and the expression on his face had shifted again away from calculation, towards something closer to the first true understanding of the scope of what he had misread. He had believed that Claire's relationships were peripheral, social, the soft connections of a wealthy woman who attended the right events and remembered birthdays. He had not understood, had never truly tried to understand that those relationships were structural, that the people in this room trusted Claire with their giving not because she was Daniel's wife, but because she had earned that trust carefully and personally over years. He was beginning to understand now. Olivia Parker had moved to a table near the exit. She was alone. The server who had been attentive to her earlier had moved on to other guests, and the social momentum that had briefly attached itself to her as Daniel's companion had dissipated with the shift in the evening's tone. She was scrolling through her phone with the focused, displaced energy of someone who has realized they are at the center of a situation they were not prepared for and is looking for a way to process that. Claire felt no particular animus toward Olivia. This surprised her slightly. She had thought, in the months since she'd learned about the affair, that when she finally faced the reality of it in a room, she would feel something sharper. Instead, what she felt was a clear-eyed recognition that Olivia Parker was not her problem and had perhaps never fully understood what she had walked into. Richard appeared at Claire's elbow. The CFO has the account summary, he said, Brennan's preliminary report, and the expense documentation. Ellison has a copy in his email as of 20 minutes ago. And the board chair from Meridian Health called. He's aware there's a governance review underway. He asked that the Foundation's leadership provide a formal update within 14 days. That's reasonable, Claire said. We'll do it in 10. Richard looked at her for a moment. He was her first cousin, the closest thing to a sibling she'd had growing up, and he knew her the way only people who have grown up alongside you can know you, not your performance, not your presentation, but the actual shape of how you think under pressure. You've been planning this for a while, he said. I've been preparing, she said. Planning implies I wanted it to happen. I didn't want it to happen. But when it happened, I intended to be ready, she finished. He was quiet for a moment. Then Mom would have loved this. Mom would have been horrified by the public nature of it, Claire said. She would have preferred it all happen quietly, through lawyers, out of sight. But she would have loved that you held your ground. Yes, Claire said, that part she would have loved. The next thing happened quietly, which was the way the most important things tended to happen. Ellison, the board chair, had finished reading the preliminary audit summary. Claire knew this because he set down his dessert fork with the careful, deliberate movement of a man who has just made a decision and is now implementing it rather than deliberating. He stood. He crossed the room to where Daniel stood, still in conversation with Porter. He interrupted without preamble, in the manner of a man who has outranked other men long enough to have stopped apologizing for it. Claire could not hear the conversation from where she stood. She watched Daniel's face. She watched the exact moment when Ellison said what he said, whatever specific words he chose to convey the information he had just received, and she watched Daniel's face do something she had never, in 12 years of marriage, seen it do. It went blank, not controlled, not performed. Genuinely blank, the way a face goes when the mind behind it has just been confronted with a reality it has no prepared response for. Porter said something. Daniel said something back, brief and sharp. Ellison said something that was clearly a statement and not a question. Daniel looked across the room at Claire. She held his gaze. She did not look away. He was the one who looked away. Margaret was beside her again, because Margaret always seemed to appear precisely when she was needed. Ellison is suspending Daniel's authority over the Foundation's accounts, pending the formal audit, Margaret said. Effective immediately. Claire absorbed this. That was faster than I expected. Ellison is a serious man, Margaret said. He saw the documents and he acted. That's what serious men do. How will Daniel respond? Badly, Margaret said, and then worse, and then eventually more realistically. That's usually how it goes. Daniel had separated himself from Ellison and Porter and was now crossing the room toward Claire with the purposeful stride of a man who has moved through shock into the first stage of something that was trying to organize itself as anger. She waited. He stopped in front of her. You did this, he said. Not shouting, he was too aware of the room for that, but with an intensity that compressed the words into something that functioned like a physical force. Which part, she asked. The audit. The accounts being frozen. You went to Ellison. I retained an auditor 6 weeks ago, she said calmly. Ellison received the preliminary report tonight. What he does with it is his decision. You planned this. I prepared for it, she said. There's a difference, Claire. He dropped his voice lower. Whatever you think happened, whatever version of this you've constructed, I am asking you, as someone who shared 12 years of our lives. I know what we shared, she said. And something in her voice must have landed differently than he expected, because he stopped. I know exactly what we shared, Daniel. I was there for all of it. I remember the first clinic. I remember the first board meeting. I remember the donor call you were terrified about, and I sat with you the night before and helped you prepare for it. I remember every conversation I had on your behalf with people who didn't know you and took my word for who you were. I remember everything. He was silent. I'm not doing this out of anger, she said. I'm doing this because it's true, and because the Foundation's mission deserves governance that reflects what the work actually is. The children who received surgeries deserve an institution that isn't being quietly used to subsidize a lifestyle that has nothing to do with them. Something flinched in his face. That word children landed. She saw it. Daniel Whitmore was many things, but he was also a surgeon who had spent his adult life in operating rooms trying to repair the hearts of small children, and that part of him was real, whatever else was not. And she had aimed at it deliberately, not to wound him, but to remind him. There are 3 families in this room tonight, she said, whose children are alive because of this Foundation's work. One of those families doesn't know about the Monaco trip. The other 2 don't know about the expense accounts. I'd like to keep it that way, which means the audit needs to resolve clearly and completely, which means cooperation is in everyone's interest, including yours. He stared at her. You're not angry, he said slowly, as if recognizing something for the first time. I told you that. You've already decided. You've already made all your decisions. Most of them, she said. Weeks ago. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture she recognized, the gesture he made when exhaustion got through the surface. Why didn't you just talk to me? Why didn't you? Because, she said, very quietly, I tried to talk to you for 2 years, Daniel. I said things were wrong. I said I felt invisible. I said the Foundation was drifting from its purpose, and our marriage was drifting from its foundation. And you told me I was being emotional, or tired, or difficult. You patted me on the shoulder and walked out of the room. She paused. I don't believe you're a bad man. I believe you stopped looking at me a long time ago. And people who aren't being looked at eventually stop waiting to be seen. The silence between them was different from any silence they had shared. It was the silence of something over, not in anger, not in bitterness, but with the specific, heavy finality of a door that has been gently, firmly, and permanently closed. Porter reappeared and put a hand on Daniel's arm, murmuring something. Daniel let himself be guided away. He did not look back. Claire turned and found herself facing someone she had not expected. Bryce, Daniel's young staff member, the one whose hands had shaken when he delivered the envelope, was standing directly right in front of her, with an expression that was the most naked thing she had seen all evening, unguarded, slightly stricken and trying very hard to find the right words. Mrs. Whitmore, he started. Bryce, I want you to know I didn't know what was in the envelope. He just told me to. He stopped. I'm sorry. I don't know if that means anything, but I wanted to say it. Claire looked at him. He was 26, maybe 27. He had been working for Daniel for 3 years and had spent those 3 years in the gravitational field of someone whose charisma was powerful and whose demands apparently were not always examined. It means something, she said. Thank you for saying it. He nodded, swallowed, and then said something she did not expect. What you said to the Kaufmans and to Helen Argent. Everyone's been watching you all night, you know. Like the whole room. Most of them just didn't realize it until right now. She blinked. I just thought you should know, he said, and moved away. She stood still for a moment, then she found Richard at her side. Claire, he said. The matter with the foundation property documentation. There's something else. She looked at him. When Daniel filed the divorce petition, Richard said, carefully, he listed as marital property 3 accounts that are not marital property. 2 are Bennett family trust accounts. 1 is your personal account, predating the marriage. She had known this was likely. She had known it and had prepared for it. Margaret knows. Margaret's been on the phone for the last 10 minutes with a colleague from the property division. Good, she thought for a moment, the vacation property in Maine. That one is genuinely complex, Richard admitted. The title is joint. But the original purchase was made with Bennett trust funds, documented as a loan to the marriage that was never formally converted. So it was a loan, with documentation, then it reverts, she said. Almost certainly. But it'll be contested. Let it be contested, she said. We have the documents. Richard looked at her steadily. You've been living with this for months. I've been living with the reality of the marriage for longer than that, she said. The legal preparation just gave me something useful to do while I processed the rest of it. He almost smiled. That's very Bennett of you. I come from a long line of people who filed their grief neatly, she said. And she meant it to be slightly wry, but it landed in her own chest with more weight than she had anticipated. She breathed through it. The room was thinning now, some guests departing, others consolidating into smaller groups, the natural end-of-evening energy asserting itself over the drama. The orchestra had moved to softer music, and the servers were collecting the last of the dessert plates. And somewhere in the back of the venue, the catering team was beginning the slow, efficient process of clearing a room that had held one of the most consequential evenings of Claire's life. Helen Argent found her one more time. She came to Claire directly, without the social approach, no circling, no gathering, just crossing the room with the deliberate stride of a woman who had decided what she wanted to say. The board will hold an emergency session on Thursday, Helen said. I'll be available. As what exactly? You're not a formal member. No, Claire said. But the Bennett Trust is the Foundation's primary property lessor and has historical documentation of the donor relationships that establish the Foundation's credibility. That gives me standing to address governance questions. Helen studied her. You've thought about this. I've thought about very little else for 6 weeks. Helen was quiet for a moment. Then there will be people who say this was about the divorce. About taking something from him. Yes. What do you say to that? I say that the divorce was the occasion, Claire said. Not the cause. The cause is that the institution we built, that my family helped build, deserves to be governed honestly. That's what this is about. And if Daniel cooperates with the audit, then the audit will say what it says, and he'll face whatever that means, and the Foundation will continue doing its work, Claire said. I don't need his destruction, I need his honesty. They're not the same thing. Helen was quiet for another moment. Then she said, your mother built something. You built something different, but from the same materials. What materials? Patience, Helen said, and the ability to stay in the room long after everyone else has underestimated you. She moved away, and Claire stood in the thinning room and felt the evening settling around her, not ending, exactly, but shifting into the next phase of itself. The dramatic turns were for tonight complete. What came next was quieter and slower and in many ways harder. The legal machinery, the institutional review, the personal reckoning with the fact that the life she had spent 12 years building was being disassembled and would have to be rebuilt, differently in the shape of something that actually fit who she was. She thought about the 9-year-old girl at the children's table who was alive because of money that had moved through an institution that Claire had helped hold together with care and attention for a decade. She thought about the families whose names she knew and whose stories she had carried. She thought about her mother, who had never needed a stage. Near the exit, she saw Olivia Parker preparing to leave. Olivia had retrieved her coat from the coat check and was standing alone near the door. And for a moment, just a moment, their eyes met across the room. Claire did not look away. Neither did Olivia. And in that moment, Claire understood something she had not expected to understand tonight. Olivia Parker was not a villain. She was a young woman who had been told, probably repeatedly, that she was the most important person in the room of a man who was, in fact, a man of extraordinary self-interest dressed in philanthropic clothing. She had not understood the architecture she was walking into. She had perhaps genuinely believed what Daniel had told her about Claire, about the life she was being invited into. Olivia's expression as she held Claire's gaze was not defiant. It was something more complicated than that. It was uncertain. The coat check attendant said something to her, and Olivia looked away, and then she was gone through the door, and Claire let her go without the weight of judgment. She had enough to carry. Richard returned one more time with Margaret beside him, and together the three of them stood in the room that was emptying, and Richard said, "We should talk tomorrow." "The full picture, my office," Claire said. 8 o'clock. "There's a lot to go through." "I know, it's going to be a hard few months." "I know that too. Are you okay?" She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "I am something more complicated than okay," she said. "But I know where I am and I know what I'm doing and I know why. That's enough for tonight." Margaret, for the first and perhaps only time in their long professional relationship, put her hand briefly on Claire's shoulder. The touch lasted only a moment. It said what it needed to. The servers moved through the room. The orchestra finished its final piece and the musicians began, quietly and efficiently, to pack their instruments. The chandeliers above the Grand Bennett Ballroom threw their light down on a room that was emptying out, and in that light Claire stood for a moment alone, or as alone as a woman could be in a public place, and let herself feel the full weight of the evening. Not the triumph of it, not yet, just the weight of it. The realness of it. 12 years dismantled in the space of an evening in a room that had belonged to her family since before her marriage had existed. The grief of that was real, and she did not pretend it wasn't, and her mother had taught her that grief had to be acknowledged before it could be carried, and eventually, slowly, set down. She acknowledged it. She stood in the light of the Bennett Ballroom and acknowledged every part of it. Then she picked up her clutch, thanked the last of the servers by name, said good night to the building manager at the door, and walked out into the night. She did not look back. What she was walking toward was uncertain, complicated, and in many ways just beginning. But it was hers, all of it was hers, and she had known. From the first moment her grandmother had pressed her hand and told her what the family name meant, and what it demanded. She had always known that whatever came, she would meet it squarely, and she would not blink. Tonight she had not blinked. Tomorrow the real work would begin. She did not sleep well. That was the truth of it, the unglamorous reality beneath the composed surface she had maintained for the entire length of that extraordinary evening. Claire Bennett Whitmore came home to the Ashworth Lane house, her house, as it turned out, or at least the house that Daniel's settlement proposal had claimed, with a confidence that the property records did not support, and she sat in the kitchen with a cup of tea she didn't drink, and stared at the wall and felt the full weight of everything that had happened come down on her at once. The composure had been real, it was not performance. But composure and wholeness were not the same thing, and in the privacy of her own kitchen, at 12:30 in the morning, she allowed herself to be something other than composed. She cried briefly, not dramatically. Just the quiet, private tears of a woman who had loved a marriage even as it was failing her, who had believed in something long after the thing had stopped deserving her belief, and who was now confronting the specific loneliness of being right about something you had desperately hoped to be wrong about. Then she stopped, washed her face, made a list for the morning. Her mother had taught her that too. By 8 o'clock the next morning she was in her office, the one in the Bennett Family Trust's building on Meridian Avenue, the office that had been hers since she formally joined the Trust's management board at 32, which Daniel had always referred to as her volunteer work with an affectionate condescension that she now recognized for exactly what it had been, and Richard was across the desk from her, and Margaret was to her left. And the CFO of the Bennett Trust, a methodical man named Avery Cho, was at the end of the table with a laptop and 3 printed folders of documentation. "Start from the beginning," Claire said. Avery opened the first folder. What he laid out over the next 90 minutes was not a simple story. It rarely was when institutional finances were examined carefully. The Whitmore Hart Foundation had been established 12 years ago using a combination of Bennett Family Trust seed funding, Daniel's personal capital, and an initial donor cohort that had been largely assembled through Claire's family connections. The trust had never held formal equity in the foundation. That had been a deliberate structural decision made early on at Eleanor Bennett's insistence, because Eleanor had believed that philanthropic institutions should have independent governance and not be controlled by family wealth. That decision, made in good faith, had created the situation they were now untangling. The foundation's formal ownership is an independent board, Avery said. Daniel is the executive director and medical director. He has broad operational authority but does not own the foundation, which he understood when he signed the governance documents, Margaret said. Which he signed, Avery confirmed, and which Garrison Legal either didn't review thoroughly or chose not to flag not to their client. What's the total of the questionable expenses? Claire asked. Avery looked at his screen. Brennan's preliminary analysis identifies approximately $230,000 in expenses over 18 months that require explanation. The number could change in either direction once the full audit is complete. $230,000. It was not, in the context of the foundation's annual budget, a catastrophic sum. The foundation operated on approximately $12 million a year. But it was enough, more than enough. It was the kind of number that, once established and documented, changed the character of everything around it. He'll say they were legitimate, Richard said. He'll have to prove it, Margaret said. Some of them probably were legitimate, Claire said, because she believed in fairness even when fairness was uncomfortable. Daniel does cultivation work, he does travel. Some of what looks anomalous may have a defensible explanation. Some, Avery said. But not the event in Monaco, and not the hotel bookings at the Villeneuve in September. The conference he claimed to be attending ended on a Thursday. The hotel checkout was the following Monday, a silence. Olivia Parker's name is on the room? Richard asked. A different name, Avery said. But the credit card used was the foundation's secondary operations card. Margaret made a small note. Claire looked at the folder in front of her and thought about what it meant, not legally, not financially, but in terms of the institution itself. The Whitmore Heart Foundation had a reputation built on the genuine outcomes of cardiac surgeries, performed on children who would not otherwise have had access to that care. That reputation was real, the surgeries were real. The families whose children were alive because of the foundation's work were real, and they trusted the institution because they had experienced its impact directly and personally. What Daniel had done, whatever the final numbers turned out to be, had not negated those outcomes. But it had put them at risk, and it had used the moral authority of those outcomes to shelter behavior that had nothing to do with them. That was what she could not forgive, not the affair. Affairs happened in broken marriages, and she had accepted the grief of that and moved through it. But the instrumentalization of the foundation, the use of charitable infrastructure to fund a private life, that was the betrayal that sat heaviest in her. She said as much to Richard after Avery and Margaret had stepped out for a call. You know what the worst part is, she said. The donors who gave because they believed in the mission. The Kaufmans, the Albrecht family. That woman who ran bake sales for 3 years in her community to raise a number for named fund. They gave because they trusted that every dollar was going where it was supposed to go. Richard listened. If this comes out badly, if it becomes a public scandal, rather than a quiet institutional correction, some of those donors will never give to anything again. They'll feel like fools, and they weren't fools. They were generous and they were deceived. Then we manage how it comes out, Richard said. Can we? We have a better chance of that than Daniel does, Richard said. We have the documentation, we have the audit. We're the ones who initiated the review. That matters in how this story gets told. He was right. She knew he was right. But knowing it and feeling it were different things, and the weight of those bake sale dollars, of that woman's trust, sat with her all morning. The Thursday board meeting was held in the Foundation's conference room on the 15th floor of a building where the Whitmore Heart Foundation had maintained its offices for 9 years. Claire arrived 5 minutes early. She had dressed with the same care she had used for the gala not to perform, but because she knew that how you appeared in important rooms communicated something, and she wanted what she communicated to be precision and seriousness and the complete absence of drama. Margaret was with her. Ellison, the board chair, was already in the room when they arrived, along with Helen Argent, 3 other board members, and the Foundation's internal counsel, a man named Sherwood who was visibly uncomfortable and doing his best to conceal it. Daniel was not there yet. He arrived 7 minutes late, which was itself a kind of statement, whether deliberate or the result of genuine difficulty in getting himself to the room. Claire could not be sure. He was with Porter and a second attorney from Garrison she had not seen before, a woman named Raines, who had the specific, composed demeanor of a litigator who had been brought in when things became more serious than expected. He did not look at Claire when he entered. She did not look away. Ellison opened the meeting with the directness of a man who had decided that the most respectful thing he could do for everyone in the room was to not waste a single minute. "We're here because the Foundation's external auditor has identified a pattern of expenditures that require formal review," Ellison said. "This is not a hearing, it is not a determination of any outcome. It is the beginning of a process that will proceed according to the Foundation's governance documents and applicable law. I want that established clearly at the outset." Porter started to say something. "I'm not finished," Ellison said without raising his voice. Porter stopped. "The board's responsibility is to the Foundation's mission," Ellison continued, "not to any individual's professional reputation, and not to the divorce proceedings that have created this situation. Those are separate matters. We treat them as separate matters." He looked around the room. No one spoke. "Dr. Whitmore," Ellison said, "you have the floor." Daniel had prepared something. Claire could tell from the quality of his composure it was the composed quality of a man who has rehearsed, who has worked with his attorneys on what to say and in what order. He spoke for approximately 15 minutes about the Foundation's achievements, about his surgical work, about his commitment to the mission, and about his belief that the expenses under review would demonstrate, upon full examination, to be legitimate operational costs related to donor development and professional engagement. He was good at it. He was always good at it. When he was finished, Helen Argent asked the first question. "The Monaco trip," she said, "September of the prior year. The expense was coded as donor development. Which donor was cultivated?" Daniel paused. "There were several. Meeting with names, please." "The Fontaine family. Philippe Fontaine, who has been in conversation with the Foundation about a potential European partnership. Philippe Fontaine's Foundation records show no contact with the Whitmore Heart Foundation in that period," Avery Cho said from Claire's end of the table. "I checked this morning." A very specific silence. "There may have been a preliminary conversation that didn't rise to the level of formal contact documentation," Porter said quickly. "Or there may not have been," Helen said. "That's what the audit will determine." She made a note. Next question. The board member named Calloway, who was an attorney himself and had been on the board for 6 years, asked about the secondary operations card. Porter said the card's usage was within Dr. Whitmore's operational discretion as executive director. Raines, the litigator, cited the governance documents. Margaret cited different sections of the same governance documents. Sherwood, the internal counsel, looked like he was reconsidering his career choices. Through all of it, Claire did not speak. This had been intentional. She had discussed it with Margaret the night before. Her formal standing in the room was as a representative of the Bennett Family Trust in its capacity as the Foundation's primary property lessor. She was not a board member. Her role in the meeting was to be present and available, not to drive the proceedings. Ellison was driving the proceedings, and Ellison was doing it correctly, and the most effective thing she could do was allow the process to work without inserting herself into it. This was one of the hardest things she had ever done, because across the table, she could hear Daniel constructing a narrative in which the expenses were legitimate, in which the audit was a tool of marital conflict rather than a genuine governance concern, in which Claire was the aggrieved wife using institutional machinery to extract personal revenge. It was an effective narrative because it was partially true. The divorce and the audit were happening simultaneously. The fact that Claire had initiated both was, in Daniel's version of events, evidence of a coordinated attack rather than a convergence of necessary actions. She wanted to speak. She did not. Ellison ran the meeting for 2 hours. At the end of those 2 hours, he announced that the board was placing the Foundation's secondary and tertiary operational accounts under temporary independent oversight, that Daniel would retain his medical director role pending the audit's completion, that his executive director authority was suspended pending the same, and that the full audit would be completed within 30 days. Porter objected. Ellison listened to the objection with patience and respect. Then he upheld the board's decision. Daniel looked at Claire for the first time since entering the room. His expression was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for anger, the focused, targeted anger of a man who believed he was being persecuted. What she saw instead was something more complicated. He looked tired. He looked for the first time in as long as she could remember, genuinely and unmistakably tired. She thought about what she'd said to him at the gala. "I believe you stopped looking at me a long time ago." She wondered, looking at him now when he had stopped looking at himself. The meeting broke. People gathered coats and laptops and moved toward the exit in the careful, subdued way of people exiting a room where something consequential had occurred, and everyone was still processing what exactly that was. Daniel was moving toward the door when Rains put a hand on his arm and murmured something. He stopped. He turned, and he looked at Claire directly, and for a moment the two attorneys and Margaret and everyone else in the room ceased to exist in any functional sense, and it was just the two of them, as it had been in the corner of the Gala, the way it had been in 1,000 rooms over 12 years. "I want to ask you something," he said, honestly. "All right, did you always know it would come to this?" She considered the question carefully because it deserved care. "No," she said. "I hoped it wouldn't. I thought for a long time that you would look around and see what was happening and choose differently. I genuinely believed that was possible." A pause. "The preparation wasn't because I wanted this outcome. It was because I'd stopped believing in the other one. And the foundation has always been about the children," she said, and her voice was flat and certain. "That is the one thing in this entire situation that has never been complicated for me." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, and it was the nod of a man who has heard something true and is trying to figure out what to do with it. He left the room. What came next, over the following 10 days, was the quiet, grinding, unglamorous machinery of institutional and legal process, the part of a story that never makes it into dramatized versions, because it consists primarily of documents and phone calls and spreadsheets and meetings in beige conference rooms. But it mattered perhaps more than anything else, because it was the part where the truth assembled itself into a form that could not be disputed. Brennan, the auditor from Tanner and Associates, was thorough. She was also, as it turned out, someone who had been doing forensic nonprofit accounting for 22 years and had seen most versions of the category of behavior she was examining. She was not shocked, she was not animated by judgment. She simply followed the numbers where they went with the patient, methodical attention of someone who trusted that numbers, properly examined, would eventually tell the truth. What they told by the end of the second week was this: the $230,000 identified in the preliminary review grew under full examination to $312,000 across 22 months. The growth was not dramatic, no single egregious transaction, no smoking gun of the kind that made cases Kiesel. It was a pattern. Small, consistent, systematically deniable individually, only visible as what it was when examined as a whole. Donor cultivation trips that included personal components billed entirely as business. Conference registrations for events Daniel had not attended. A consultant payment made to an email address that, when traced, connected to a personal account associated with Olivia Parker's prior employer. Not her name on the account, but close enough that the connection, once identified, did not require much imagination to complete. Brennan delivered her final report on a Tuesday morning. Ellison called an emergency board meeting for that afternoon. Claire was in her Bennett Trust office when Margaret called her. "The audit is complete," Margaret said, "and $312,000 over 22 months. 3 transactions involving the Olivia Parker connection. 1 payment that may constitute a formal misappropriation under the Foundation's charter rather than a governance violation. Sherwood is reviewing that distinction." What does Ellison want to do? He's asking for a board vote on Daniel's permanent removal as executive director. He wants it done today. Claire was quiet for a moment. "Is that the right call?" she asked. Margaret paused. It was the kind of pause that meant Margaret had an opinion, but wanted Claire to think it through herself first. "He's an extraordinary surgeon," Claire said. "The medical directorship is separate from the executive role. The Foundation's outcomes depend on the clinical leadership." "That's true. Removing him from both simultaneously today will look like a purge. It will feed the narrative that this is personal." "Also true. What does the board need to protect the institution?" "Clean financial governance," Margaret said. "Clear accountability. A credible statement to donors." "Which requires acknowledging the executive failure," Claire said, "but doesn't require ending his clinical role on the same day." "Ellison would agree with that," Margaret said. "I think he's waiting for someone to give him that framing." "Then give it to him." There was a brief pause. Then Margaret said quietly, "You know, there are people who would not do that. Who would take the cleaner, harder hit today, I know. You're protecting a man who handed you divorce papers in public." "I'm protecting the Foundation," Claire said. "And the children whose surgeries are scheduled for next quarter under his clinical leadership." "Those aren't the same decision." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Your mother raised a fair woman. My mother raised a strategic one, Claire said. Fairness and strategy aren't always opposites. The board met that afternoon and voted. 6-1 the dissenting vote was Calloway, who believed the full removal was necessary for clean accountability to terminate Daniel's executive directorship effective immediately, while retaining his medical director role, pending a 60-day review of his clinical conduct and formal completion of the governance investigation. Porter, at Daniel's instruction, did not contest the vote. This surprised Claire slightly. It surprised her more when, 2 days later, Porter called Margaret and said that Daniel was requesting a private conversation with Claire. Not through lawyers, not in a formal setting, just the two of them. He gave a reason, Claire asked Margaret. He said he wants to talk about the Foundation's future, specifically the donor relationships. Claire thought about this. Does he understand, she said, that any conversation we have outside of formal channels may be discoverable in the divorce proceedings? He does, Margaret said. His exact words were, "Tell her I know, and I'm asking anyway." She agreed to meet him. They met in the lobby cafe of the Bennett Trust building, her territory, her choice of location, which she had chosen deliberately because she wanted him to understand that the geography of their interactions had shifted. She arrived first. She ordered coffee. She waited. He arrived on time, which she noted the old Daniel had always been 5 minutes late to everything, a habit that had once seemed like the confident informality of a busy man and now seemed, in retrospect, like a small performance of indispensability. He sat down. He looked different from the Gala version of himself. Not diminished exactly, but stripped of the particular energy that the Gala had run on the performed confidence, the managed presentation. He looked like the man she had met at a medical conference 17 years ago, before the Foundation, before the fame. He looked like the surgeon who had been terrified about his first donor call and had sat with her the night before and practiced what to say. She had forgotten that she had liked that man very much. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You said it was about the Foundation." "It is." He put his hands on the table, just his hands open, which she recognized as a gesture of deliberate honesty. "The Kaufman family called me," he said. "Harold Kaufman." He wanted to talk about their continued commitment. What did he say? He said that their giving was a relationship with the Foundation's mission. "Not with me." A pause. He said, "And I want you to know," he said this unprompted, "that Claire Whitmore had built the relationship that made their family's confidence in the institution possible." She was quiet. "He's going to honor their commitment," Daniel said. "He wanted me to know that. I think he also wanted me to understand why." "Why are you telling me this?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment she saw him working through something, not a performance, but the actual internal process of a man trying to articulate something honest. "Because I think I spent 12 years believing that what I brought to the Foundation was the thing that made it work," he said. "My name, my surgical reputation, my ability to stand in a room and make people feel good about giving. And I think I told myself that story so completely that I stopped seeing the other story. The one that was actually keeping it alive." She said nothing. "The donor relationships," he said. "The property arrangements, the governance infrastructure, the way you knew people. The way you remembered their children's names and their family histories and what they actually cared about underneath the philanthropy." He paused. "I called it soft work. I used to think of it as the social layer, the decorative part." "I know," she said. "I was wrong." The words sat on the table between them. She believed him. That was the complicated thing. She believed that in this moment, in this stripped-down version of himself, he meant it. She also understood that meaning it in this moment was not the same as having understood it in any of the 1,000 moments when the understanding might have changed something. "What do you want from this conversation, Daniel?" she asked. "I want to know when the audit is complete, when the legal process is finished, whether the Foundation can survive this. Whether the donors will stay. Most of them will," she said. "The Kaufmans will, the Albrechts, the families whose children had surgeries. They're committed to the mission, not the man. And the ones who leave. Some will," she said honestly. "The ones whose giving was more attached to your public image than to the outcomes. You'll lose some of those. That's the cost of what happened." He absorbed this. "The children on the surgical waiting list," he said. "The cases I'm scheduled for next quarter. The board's 60-day review. We'll be fair," she said. "No one is trying to end your surgical career. The clinical review is about your conduct as a clinician, not your personal finances. If the record is clean, and I have no reason to believe it isn't, you'll come through it. "You're being fair to me," he said, as if this surprised him. "I'm being fair to the children on your waiting list," she said. "You happen to be the surgeon." A long pause. "I know this doesn't change anything," he said. "What I did, the divorce, the choices I made over the last 2 years, I know saying I understand it differently now doesn't repair anything." "No," she said, "it doesn't, but I wanted to say it anyway." She looked at him across the table, this man she had loved and built a life with and watched become someone she no longer recognized, and was now watching, in fragments, try to find his way back to something more honest. She felt unexpectedly a brief and genuine compassion for him. Not forgiveness, not yet, perhaps not ever, not in the way that word was sometimes used as though it meant returning to what was before. But compassion for the specific human experience of being confronted with the distance between who you believed you were and who you had actually been. "Take care of your patients," she said. "That's still yours. That's still real." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He looked, for the first time in the conversation, like a man who was beginning to understand what he had and what he had thrown away, and what in the narrow lane of what remained he might still do with integrity. He left first. Claire sat for a while longer, finishing her coffee. Her phone showed a message from Richard. Meridian Health called. They're renewing their partnership commitment. Specifically requested to work through the Bennett Trust going forward. Then a message from Ellison. Board is satisfied with the audit framework. Donor communication strategy approved. We'd like your input on the leadership transition. Then a message from an unknown number that resolved, when she checked, to a personal email she had not seen before. It was from Bryce, Daniel's former staff member, who had apparently resigned 2 days after the gala, and was asking if she knew of any foundation work where someone with event management experience and, his words, a renewed interest in working for people who are actually doing what they say they're doing, might be useful. She read all 3 messages. Then she sat in the cafe of the building that bore her family's name, in the city where her mother had raised her to understand that the most powerful thing a woman could be was exactly who she was without apology, and she understood with the quiet, unshowy certainty of something genuinely known, rather than perform, that what was on the other side of all of this was not a lesser version of her life. It was the real one, the one that had always been waiting for her to stop making room for someone else's version of what she was supposed to be. The process was not over. The legal proceedings would grind on for months. The audit's formal conclusions would require responses, filings, and negotiations that would occupy Margaret and Porter and 2 separate courts for the better part of a year. The divorce itself, the actual legal dissolution of 12 years, would be its own category of exhausting and sad and necessary. None of that was over. But something else was also true. Something that was not about process or legal frameworks or institutional governance. The woman who had stood in the corner of the Bennett ballroom holding a glass of sparkling water and watching her husband work the room with another woman on his arm, that version of Claire Whitmore, was over. What came next was still forming, but it was hers, and she was no longer afraid of it. The divorce proceedings formally opened on a Wednesday morning in late October, 6 weeks after the gala, in a courtroom on the 4th floor of the Meridian County Family Court building. Claire arrived 8 minutes early. She wore gray, a deliberate choice, because gray communicated neither aggression nor apology, and she had decided months ago that nothing about her conduct in this process would communicate either of those things. Margaret was beside her. Avery Cho was in the gallery with 2 binders of financial documentation. Richard had offered to come. She had told him it wasn't necessary yet. She wanted to see how Daniel's side opened before she decided what was necessary. Porter led for Daniel. He was a competent attorney. She had developed a grudging professional respect for him over the preceding weeks, partly because he had not tried to make this uglier than it had to be, which she suspected reflected more his own professional standards than his client's instructions. He made his opening clearly and efficiently. The marriage was 12 years old. The assets under dispute were substantial, and it was his client's position that those assets had been built through the combined effort and contribution of both parties and should be divided accordingly. Standard language, professionally delivered. Then Raines, the litigator, stood to make a supplemental argument that had not been previewed in the prior week's filings, and this was the first indication that Daniel's legal strategy had shifted in ways Claire had not fully anticipated. Raines argued that the Bennett family trusts claimed ownership of multiple assets: the ballroom, the related real estate holdings, The donor relationships documented as trust property represented what she characterized as a retroactive restructuring designed to minimize the marital estate in anticipation of divorce proceedings. In other words, Rains was arguing that Claire had manufactured the trust's ownership position. Margaret's hand, resting on the table beside Claire's, pressed down slightly. The pressure communicated, "I see it, I'm already on it." Claire kept her expression neutral. This was interesting. Not because it was true, it was comprehensively, documentably false, and every trust instrument and property record going back to 1987 would confirm it, but because it told her something about where Daniel's strategy had moved in the 6 weeks since the gala. He had shifted from claiming that the assets were marital property to claiming that Claire had fraudulently characterized them as non-marital. It was a harder argument to make. It was also, she recognized, a more desperate one. Margaret rose to respond and did so with the particular pleasure of an attorney who has spent 4 decades building cases and has just been handed an argument she can demolish with documentation. The Bennett Family Trust was established in 1987, Margaret said. My client was born in 1979. She was 8 years old when this trust was formed. The trust's ownership of the relevant properties predates not only the marriage but my client's legal adulthood. The suggestion that she retroactively structured these assets is not a legal argument, it is a factual impossibility. She set a single document on the table. The trust instrument, she said, dated March 14, 1987, notarized and registered in this county. I'm happy to wait while opposing counsel reviews it. A pause. We've seen the document, Rains said. Then I'm confused about the basis of the retroactive structuring claim, Margaret said pleasantly. The judge, a woman in her late 50s named Ashworth who had the composed, faintly exhausted demeanor of someone who had seen every variety of matrimonial conflict and had stopped being surprised by any of them, looked at Rains. Counselor, Judge Ashworth said, is the trust instrument's authenticity in dispute? A pause. No, Your Honor, Rains said. Then the retroactive structuring argument is not available to you, Judge Ashworth said, in the tone of someone closing a door that should not have been opened. Move on. Claire did not allow herself to exhale visibly, but something in her chest settled. Porter took over from Rains, pivoting cleanly to the assets that were genuinely in dispute: the Ashworth Lane house, a portfolio of joint investments made during the marriage, and a financial contribution Daniel claimed to have made to the Bennett Trust operations during a particular year, which he argued entitled him to some form of equity claim. This last piece was new. Margaret looked at the filing number Porter cited. She looked at Claire. Claire looked back, and in that exchange of glances was a conversation that needed no words. Margaret had not seen this specific argument in prior filings because it had not been there. It had been added at the last moment, and the fact that it had been added at the last moment meant that someone on Daniel's team had recently identified what they believed was leverage they had not previously recognized. The contribution Porter was referencing was a transfer Daniel had made from his personal accounts to the Bennett Trust operations account. In year 4 of their marriage, a transfer of approximately $800,000, documented as a personal gift to the trust in recognition of the trust's support of the foundation's early operations. Claire remembered this. She remembered the conversation they'd had before Daniel made the transfer. She remembered telling him explicitly that a gift to the trust was a gift irrevocable, not creating equity, not generating any claim against trust assets. She remembered him saying he understood. She remembered him signing the gift documentation that confirmed exactly those terms. What she did not know, what became clear in the next 20 minutes as Porter developed the argument, was that Daniel was now claiming he had signed that documentation under a misapprehension of its legal effect, that he had believed the transfer created a form of partnership interest, that the documentation had not adequately disclosed the true nature of what he was signing. Porter was arguing, in effect, that Daniel had been deceived. By Claire, she sat very still. The room felt different suddenly. Not frightening, she knew the documentation. She trusted the documentation. She trusted Margaret, but it felt different because this argument, unlike the retroactive structuring argument Rains had made and lost in 5 minutes, this argument required something more than producing a document. It required telling a story, and Daniel, whatever else he was extraordinarily good at telling stories. Margaret asked for a 15-minute recess to review the new filing. Judge Ashworth granted it. In the corridor outside the courtroom, Margaret was already on her phone. She walked as she talked, the specific walking while talking pace that meant she was moving fast and expecting others to keep up. "I need the gift documentation from year 4, she said to someone on the phone. "All of it, the transfer records, the acknowledgement letter, the independent counsel certification." "Independent counsel certification?" Claire asked, keeping her voice low. Margaret covered the phone. "When Daniel made the gift, your mother insisted he obtain independent legal advice before signing. She did not want any question of misrepresentation." "I remember," Claire said. "He used Alderman and Associates. An alderman certified in writing that Daniel had received independent legal advice regarding the nature and terms of the gift and understood them fully." Margaret uncovered the phone. "Get me the alderman certification. It's in the trust archive from year 4. She hung up. "He signed a document confirming he had independent legal advice," Claire said. "He did, and he's arguing he didn't understand what he was signing." "Despite the independent attorney certification that he did," Margaret said. "Yes." Claire paused. "That's a very difficult position for his attorneys to maintain." "It's not maintainable," Margaret said flatly. "Once we produce the alderman certification, that argument dies." "But here's the question, why did his attorneys make it? They're not stupid people. Raines in particular is very good. Why make an argument you can't win?" Claire thought about this. She thought about it the way she thought about most things, not in the heat of the moment, but slightly to the side of it, from the angle that let her see the shape of the thing rather than just the surface. "Because the argument itself is the point," she said slowly. "Not winning it. Making it." Margaret looked at her. "If it goes into the public record," Claire said, "that Daniel Whitmore claimed he was deceived by his wife into signing away $800,000, that narrative exists, regardless of whether it succeeds legally. The press picks it up. The donors hear it. People who already want to believe the foundation crisis is about a marital dispute rather than genuine financial misconduct now have a story that supports that reading." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That's correct," she said. "And it's sophisticated. So how do we respond?" "We produce the alderman certification the moment court resumes," Margaret said. "We request that the argument be struck from the record and the filing be noted as frivolous." And then she paused. "I want to make a statement to the court about the nature of the opposition's strategy, not inflammatory, just factual. The pattern of late filings, the sequence of arguments made and immediately abandoned, the apparent intent to create public narrative through court filings rather than to establish legal merit. Will Ashworth allow it?" "Ashworth is smart enough to have already noticed it," Margaret said. "She may welcome the opportunity to say something about it herself." When court resumed, Margaret produced the alderman certification within 3 minutes. She also produced the original gift documentation with Daniel's signature and the date, and alderman's formal letter, dated the same week, confirming that Daniel Arthur Whitmore had received independent legal counsel prior to executing the gift agreement and had represented to counsel that he fully understood its terms. Porter and Raines conferred in tones too low for anyone else to hear. Then Porter stood and said that his client would be withdrawing the misrepresentation claim. Judge Ashworth looked at him for a moment with the expression of someone who has heard something technically acceptable, but is not entirely satisfied with it. "Counselor," she said to Margaret, "you had something you wished to say to the court regarding the structure of the opposition's filings." "I do, Your Honor," Margaret said, and she said it with the measured, clear-voiced precision of someone who had been in courtrooms for 4 decades and knew exactly how much weight each word could carry. She spoke for 6 minutes. She said nothing that was inaccurate. She said nothing inflammatory. She cited dates and filing numbers and the specific sequence of arguments made and abandoned. She noted that the retroactive structuring argument had been filed 24 hours before the proceeding and withdrawn within 15 minutes of opening. She noted that the misrepresentation argument had similarly been filed at the last possible moment and withdrawn upon production of a document that had been available to opposing counsel at any point in the prior 6 weeks. She noted that this pattern, late filings, rapid abandonment, arguments constructed not around legal merit, but around the creation of a discoverable record, appeared designed to generate public narrative through the court process rather than to advance a legitimate legal claim. She concluded by requesting that the court note the pattern in the official record. Judge Ashworth said that the court had noted it. Porter began to say something. Judge Ashworth said, without particular emphasis but with considerable finality, that she would be reviewing the filings herself, and that counsel for both sides should expect heightened scrutiny of any further late additions to the record. Claire kept her face still. Inside she felt something that was not quite triumph, but was adjacent to it, the specific satisfaction of a person who has been patient and is watching that patience and care pay off in the precise way they were designed to. After court adjourned for the day, she and Margaret sat in the conference room of Margaret's office suite with 2 cups of coffee and the particular exhausted quiet of people who have been in a high-stakes environment for several hours and are now decompressing. "He's running out of runway," Margaret said. "What does he have left that's actually viable?" "The joint investment portfolio is genuinely marital property," Margaret said. "We'll negotiate that. The Ashworth Lane house is more complex. The purchase was partially funded by Bennett's trust funds documented as a loan, but the title is joint, and there was habitation. We'll likely end up negotiating a buyout on that one. And his surgical income during the marriage, he'll argue it's exempt as professional earnings. We'll argue the Bennett Trust's financial support of his early career infrastructure enabled those earnings. That one will go to mediation most likely. Meaning we both get less than we want and more than we deserve," Claire said. "That's what mediation means, yes," Margaret said. Claire looked at her coffee. Realistically, she says, what does he actually end up with? Margaret considered this with the careful, practical honesty that Claire had always valued in her. His surgical career, she said. His medical reputation, which is genuinely earned and will survive this if he lets it. Thought from the joint investments, probably somewhere between 30 and 40% of the portfolio after legal costs. Nothing from the trust assets, nothing from the foundation properties. The main house will likely go to you via the loan documentation." She paused. He had access to an extraordinary platform for 12 years. He benefited enormously from the Bennett family's network, property, and institutional credibility. He loses all of that. What remains is what he built himself. His surgical skill, Claire said. His surgical skill, Margaret confirmed. It was, Claire thought, not nothing. It was, in fact, the best and truest thing about Daniel Whitmore, the part of him that had drawn her to him in the first place, that had made her believe in his potential, that was real in a way that his public persona, for all its polish, had never quite been. She hoped he would recognize that. She suspected for the first time that he was beginning to. 3 days later, Claire received a call she had not expected. Olivia Parker called her directly, not through an attorney, not through an intermediary. Directly, on the mobile number that Olivia had apparently obtained through some means Claire chose not to examine too closely, at 7:40 in the morning when Claire was on her second cup of coffee and reviewing donor correspondence. She almost didn't answer, she answered. "Mrs. Whitmore," Olivia said. Her voice was careful and controlled in the way that voices are careful and controlled when the person using them is managing considerable emotion underneath the surface. "Miss Parker," Claire said, a pause. "I know I have no right to call you," Olivia said. "You called," Claire said, "so say what you need to say." Another pause, and in the pause, Claire heard Olivia making a decision. "I want you to know," Olivia said, "that I didn't know about the foundation accounts. I knew some of the trips were. I knew they were charged to the foundation. He told me it was standard, that donors expected a certain level of hospitality, and the foundation budgeted for it. I didn't ask questions I should have asked." "No," Claire said. "You didn't. I'm not making excuses. I didn't want you to believe that I knew what I was participating in." Claire thought about what to say. She thought about the young woman she had watched across the gala room, uncertain, miscalibrated, genuinely surprised by the evening's revelations. She thought about the pattern of a man who was extraordinarily skilled at presenting people with the version of reality that made their participation in his story feel reasonable and even virtuous. "Daniel's very good at framing things," Claire said. "Yes," Olivia said, and something in her voice broke slightly on the word. "He is. Are you all right?" Claire asked, and she meant it, not as performance, not as the gracious magnanimity of the wronged wife, but as a genuine question from one person to another. Olivia stopped. "I will be. I moved out of the apartment. I'm back in my own lease. Good," Claire said. "That's all I wanted to say," Olivia said. "I know it doesn't change anything, but I needed you to know that I knew I understand now how little I understood." The call ended. Claire set her phone down on her desk and sat for a moment with what had just happened. She thought about the particular category of woman who ends up in Olivia Parker's position, not a villain, not a calculated homewrecker, but a person who had been offered a story and had believed it, as people do, Because the person telling it was compelling, and the story felt like an upgrade, and the questions that might have punctured it were uncomfortable enough that not asking them was easier. She had been offered a story once, too. The story of Daniel Whitmore, extraordinary surgeon, visionary philanthropist, man of the year, man who chose her. She had believed that story for longer than she should have. She had in fact built significant portions of it with her own hands. The difference was that her version of belief had been accompanied by genuine work and genuine care and genuine outcomes. The Foundation's work was real because she had made it real. But the belief itself, the willingness to accept a curated version of a person without examining the unexamined, that was something she and Olivia Parker had in common. She did not hold it against Olivia. She filed it carefully into the growing archive of things she understood about herself that she had not fully understood before. The weeks that followed had a quality she had not anticipated. They were, in several important respects, productive. Not comfortable, the legal proceedings had their grinding. Expensive, emotionally draining rhythm, and there were days when Margaret called with complications, and Claire sat in her office afterward, and felt the full weight of what dismantling a 12-year life actually cost. But underneath the difficulty, something else was happening. The Foundation's donor communications went out 3 weeks after the gala, a careful, honest letter drafted by Claire, approved by Ellison and the board, that acknowledged the governance review, described the steps being taken to ensure financial accountability, and reaffirmed the Foundation's commitment to its mission. The letter did not mention Daniel by name in any context other than his continued clinical role. It did not assign blame, it described process and outcome. The response was, in the aggregate, better than they had hoped. The Kaufman family confirmed their commitment within 48 hours. The Albrecht family, who had been silent since the gala, and whose silence had been a source of considerable anxiety, called on the 10th day. Harold Albrecht, who was 81 years old and had been giving money to causes he believed in since 1968, and had accordingly developed a finely calibrated sense of which institutions deserved continued trust, spoke with Claire directly for 20 minutes and asked questions that were pointed, fair, and clearly informed by a careful reading of everything available. At the end of the conversation, he said, "My wife and I gave to the work, not the man. The work is still there. The work is still there," Claire said. "Then so are we," he said. She sat with the phone in her hand for a long moment after that call ended. The smaller donors, the individuals who gave hundreds or a few thousand annually, the families who organized local fundraising, the woman who had run bake sales, whose name was Patrice, and who had given Claire her mobile number 2 years ago and texted her pictures of her community's fundraising events. These were the donors Claire called personally. She called Patrice on a Tuesday afternoon. Patrice answered on the second ring. "Ms. Bennett," Patrice said. She had always called her by her family name, a form of respect that Claire had never quite known how to redirect. "Patrice, I wanted to call you myself. I heard things weren't right," Patrice said. "People have been calling me, asking me what I know. I told them I know the surgeries happened and the children got better, and that's what I gave money for." "That's right," Claire said. "That's exactly right. Are the children still getting surgeries?" "Yes." "Then I don't see what my business is with the rest of it," Patrice said, with the particular moral clarity of someone who had decided what mattered and was not to be redirected from it. Claire thanked her. She thanked her more genuinely than she had thanked almost anyone in the preceding weeks. The Foundation's interim executive director, a woman named Caroline Marsh, whom Ellison had recruited from a national health nonprofit, and who was, in Claire's assessment, possibly the most well-suited person for the role she could have imagined, came on board in the 4th week. She was 57, had run organizations through 3 separate institutional crises, and had the specific, invaluable quality of someone who was genuinely unimpressed by the drama that surrounded her and interested only in the functioning of the institution. She and Claire had coffee on Caroline's first day. "I've reviewed the donor files," Caroline said. "The relationship documentation. The correspondence records you maintained, and whoever built those relationships built them correctly," Caroline said. "There's genuine trust there, not transactional, not conditional on the institution's public image. That's unusual, and it's valuable, and it's going to be what gets this organization through the next year." "It took 10 years to build," Claire said. "I know," Caroline said. "That's what I mean. You can't manufacture that. Someone did the work." "My mother started it," Claire said. "I continued it. Caroline looked at her for a moment. Would you consider a formal role on the board or as an advisor, something that puts your knowledge of these relationships in a position where the institution can rely on it formally rather than informally? Claire had not expected this question, which was unusual because she had been expecting most things. I'd want to be careful about the optics, Claire said. With the divorce proceeding still active, a formal role could look like consolidation of control, Caroline said. I know, that's why I said advisor rather than a governance role. Something that's about the relationships, not the authority. Claire thought about it. Ask me again in 60 days, she said, when the audit is formally closed and the governance review is complete. The answer will probably be yes, but the timing matters. Caroline nodded. She was the kind of person who understood that timing mattered. Claire liked her immediately. Daniel's clinical review concluded on a Thursday in the 6th week after the gala. The review panel found no irregularities in his clinical practice or patient care. His surgical outcomes during the review period were consistent with his historical record, excellent. The panel recommended his continued service as medical director with no restrictions. Claire heard this from Ellison on a Friday morning. She said, "Good. You sound like you mean that," Ellison said. "I do," she said. "The patients on his schedule are real people. I have never wanted anything to happen to his surgical career." "Some people find that hard to believe," Ellison said. "Given everything. Then some people don't understand what this has actually been about," she said. What it had actually been about what she had known since long before the gala, since the months of quiet preparation, since the early weeks of understanding that the marriage was over, and the question was only how honestly it would end, was not the destruction of Daniel Whitmore. It was never about that. It was about the truth of what each of them had built and what each of them had taken and what each of them actually owned. It was about the specific clarifying experience of being forced to examine a shared life with the cold precision of documents and records, and the question, what is actually mine? And what was actually hers was more than she had sometimes allowed herself to claim. The Foundation's mission was hers not legally, not on any piece of paper, but in the bones of it, in the relationships that made it possible, and the outcomes that justified its existence. The Bennett family's legacy was hers, built by her grandmother, expanded by her mother, passed to her with the specific intention that she would do exactly what she had done, hold it carefully, use it for something that mattered, and not let anyone mistake access for ownership. The relationships she had built, the Kaufmans, the Albrechts, Patrice with her bake sales, Helen Argent with her moral seriousness, Ellison with his institutional steadiness, were hers in the way that things built over time. Dewey's attention and care belonged to the person who built them. And the understanding she had arrived at, the specific, costly, real understanding of who she was outside the role of someone's wife, someone's quiet partner, someone's invisible infrastructure that was hers most of all. The settlement negotiations began in week 7, with a mediation session that lasted 9 hours, and ended without resolution, but with a framework both sides agreed was worth continuing. Porter, at the end of the day, said to Margaret in the corridor, "Your client is very precise." "She is," Margaret said. "It makes negotiation difficult." "It does," Margaret agreed. "It also makes the eventual agreement more durable, because everything in it will be accurate." Porter looked at his shoes for a moment, then he said in a quieter tone, "He knows he handled this badly." "Which part?" Margaret asked. "All of it," Porter said. "I think from what I can tell he's known for a while." Margaret said nothing. "For what it's worth," Porter said, "I think he understands now what he had." "What he had," Margaret said, "is still very much in existence. It just no longer belongs to him." She walked away. And that, Claire thought, when Margaret relayed the exchange later that evening, was the most accurate single sentence anyone had spoken about the situation since the gala. What she had built was still in existence. It just finally belonged entirely to her. The settlement was signed on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of December, 4.5 months after the gala. Margaret placed the final page in front of Claire at 8:14 in the morning, and Claire read every line of it, not because she hadn't read every prior draft, not because anything had changed overnight, but because her mother had taught her that you read every document you sign, every time, without exception, and you do not let the familiarity of a thing make you careless about the reality of it. She read it, then she signed it. Margaret countersigned as witness. Porter, across the table, collected the pages for Daniel's signature, which had already been obtained that morning at a separate location. Daniel had not come to the signing. That had been his choice, communicated through Porter 3 days earlier, and Claire had felt the news land with a complicated mixture of relief and something smaller and sadder that she acknowledged privately and did not name in any room where anyone else could hear it. "It's done," Margaret said when the last page was collected. "Tell me what we got," Claire said, though she knew. She wanted to hear it stated plainly, cleanly, in the voice of the woman who had fought for it. "The Ashworth Lane house bought out at full market value from the joint estate. You retain it outright. The main property reverts to the Bennett Trust per the loan documentation. 38% of the joint investment portfolio goes to Daniel. The remainder stays with you. The foundation properties are confirmed as Bennett Trust assets not subject to division. Daniel waives any claim against the trust going back to the year 4 gift." Margaret paused. "And a formal acknowledgement, in writing, that the donor relationship infrastructure was built through the Bennett family's independent institutional history, not through the marriage." That last item had been the hardest fought. Porter had resisted it for 3 weeks. Not because it was legally necessary, it wasn't, in any strict sense, but because it was the one item in the settlement that functioned as a statement of historical record rather than a financial division. It said, in language that would sit permanently in a legal document, that certain things had existed before Daniel Whitmore and would continue to exist after him and had never, despite appearances, been his. Daniel had eventually agreed to it. She had not asked Margaret why. She had a feeling she knew. She had a feeling it was connected to the coffee conversation in the Bennett Trust lobby, to something that had shifted in him during the weeks of process and institutional reckoning, not a transformation, not a redemption arc in any tidy narrative sense, but the specific private recognition of a person who has finally stopped arguing with the truth. "Good," Claire said. She stood, she put on her coat. She thanked Margaret, who had been doing this kind of work for 4 decades and still managed, in this particular moment, to look at Claire with an expression that contained something more personal than professional satisfaction. "Your mother would be extraordinarily proud," Margaret said. Not for the first time. But this time it landed differently, not comfort but as confirmation. "I know," Claire said, and she walked out into December. The Foundation's formal audit closed the following week with findings that were exactly what Brennan's preliminary report had suggested. Neither worse nor better, which was itself a kind of relief. The board of the Whitmore Hart Foundation met one final time under its existing governance structure, accepted the audit's findings, approved a set of governance reforms that Caroline Marsh had spent 6 weeks developing, and formally ratified Caroline's appointment as permanent executive director. They also, at Ellison's motion and with a vote of 7-0, voted to rename the Foundation's primary annual event. It would no longer be called the Whitmore Hart Foundation Gala. It would be called, going forward, the Bennett Hart Gala. Ellison called Claire to tell her before the press release went out. She was in her Bennett Trust office when the call came. She was at her desk, reviewing a proposal from a hospital network in the southeastern United States that wanted to partner with the Foundation on a new pediatric cardiac program, and her coffee was hot, and the morning light was coming through the window. And when Ellison said the words, she sat very still for a moment with the phone pressed against her ear. "The vote was unanimous," Ellison said. "No discussion needed, actually. Helen made the motion, Calloway seconded it immediately. I didn't have to say anything." "I don't know what to say," Claire said. "You don't have to say anything," Ellison said. "That's rather the point." After she hung up, she sat for a long time without moving. She was not a woman who cried easily in professional contexts. She had spent 12 years training herself out of it, not because emotion was weakness she had come to understand that was a profound misreading of what emotion actually was, but because she had learned that her tears in professional rooms were interpreted by people who wanted to dismiss her as evidence that she was too emotional to be taken seriously. So she had learned to hold it differently, to let what she felt move through her without spilling over in spaces where it would be used against her. In her own office alone, on a December morning, she let it spill. Not for long, but fully and without apology. Then she wiped her face, picked up her coffee, and called Richard. "Did you know?" she asked when he answered, a pause. "Helen called me last night," he said. "She wanted to know if you would accept it." "What did you tell her?" "I told her you would accept it the way you accept everything, with composure, and a thank you, and probably a follow-up call to every board member personally to express genuine gratitude." "You know me well," she said. "I grew up with you," he said. I watched you organize your mother's estate with the same precision she applied to everything, and I watched you not cry in front of any of the lawyers, and then cry in the car on the way home. You're consistent. She smiled. Is that a compliment? It's an observation, he said. The compliment is that you're the best person I know at doing hard things quietly. She held that for a moment. I have to make thank you calls, she said. I know, he said. Call Helen first. She'll appreciate it. She called Helen first. Helen picked up on the third ring with the immediate alertness of a woman who had been expecting the call. I'm not going to make a speech, Helen said, before Claire could open with whatever she had been preparing to open with. I'm going to say what I said to the board and what I believe. The foundation was built on Bennett credibility, Bennett relationships, and Bennett values, and it should carry that name going forward. That's not sentiment. That's accuracy. Thank you, Claire said. Don't thank me. Continue the work. That's the only thanks I want. I intend to, Claire said. A pause. Your daughter called me, Helen said then. Did you know that? Claire went still. She did not have a daughter. Helen knew she did not have a daughter, and for a brief, disorienting moment, Claire processed the sentence and came up empty. I don't, she started, Patrice, Helen said, the woman with the bake sales. She called me last week. She wanted to know if there was a way to organize a community recognition event for the foundation, a grassroots thing, neighborhood level, to show support during what she called the difficult period. She didn't use your name, but everything she described was about you. She called you the woman who remembered everyone. Claire felt something catch in her throat. She's not my daughter, Claire said. No, Helen said, but she's what you built. The fact that a woman you've never met face-to-face organized a neighborhood event because she believed in the institution you shaped, that's not a legacy, Claire. That's a life's work showing up in the world. After she hung up with Helen, she sat with that for a long time. The recognition event Patrice had organized took place on a Saturday in mid-December in a community center on the east side of the city that Claire had never been to and found, when she arrived, considerably smaller and considerably warmer than any of the gala venues she had spent the last decade in. There were folding tables and donated food, and a handmade banner that read, "Thank you. Bennett Hart Foundation," in letters that were enthusiastic if not precisely uniform, and there were approximately 60 people in the room, most of them parents and grandparents, and a few children who were running between the chairs with the specific tragic indifference of children who have no interest in adult proceedings. Patrice met her at the door. She was in her mid-50s with the kind of face that had laughed a lot and worried a lot in roughly equal measure and wore both experiences openly. She put out her hand when she saw Claire and then, apparently deciding that a handshake was insufficient, pulled her into a brief, firm hug that lasted exactly long enough to be genuine without being theatrical. I wasn't sure you'd come, Patrice said. You called me personally, Claire said. Of course I came. Some people say they'll come and they don't, Patrice said. Important people, especially. I'm not that kind of important, Claire said. Patrice looked at her with the direct, undeceivable gaze of a woman who had spent decades figuring out which people meant what they said. No, Patrice said, I don't think you are. The room was not the Grand Bennett Ballroom. It had no chandelier, no orchestra, no engraved invitations, no $400 plates. What it had was the specific, irreplaceable energy of people who were there because they chose to be, because they believed in something, because the thing they believed in had touched their lives in ways that felt personal enough to show up for on a Saturday afternoon. Two of the families in the room had children who had received surgeries funded by the foundation. One of the children, a boy named Marcus, who was 7 years old and running between the chairs with the aforementioned indifference to adult proceedings, had been 4 when his surgery was performed. His mother, a woman named Darlene who had met Claire only once before at a foundation event 2 years ago, found her near the refreshment table. He doesn't know what any of this means, Darlene said, watching Marcus negotiate a turn around a folding chair at speed. He doesn't need to, Claire said. When he's older, I'm going to tell him, Darlene said. About the foundation and about what it took to keep it going. A pause. About you. Tell him about the work, Claire said. That's what matters. Can I ask you something? Darlene said. Of course, were you scared? When everything happened at the gala, and then the legal stuff, and all of it, were you scared it would fall apart? Claire looked across the room at Marcus, who had now recruited 2 other children into whatever game he had invented and was directing their movements with the confident authority of someone who had never once doubted his right to be exactly where he was. Yes, she said. I was scared every day for about 3 months. Darlene nodded, as if this was the answer she had expected and the answer she needed. But you kept going, she said. I kept going, Claire said. Because of them, Darlene said. And she didn't gesture at Marcus or at the room, she just said it, simply, as a statement of what she believed to be true. Yes, Claire said, because of them. The event lasted 2 hours. Patrice made a short speech that was the most honest and untheatrical public address Claire had heard in years. No prepared remarks, no rhetorical architecture, just a woman standing in front of 60 people and saying plainly what she meant. She said that the foundation had done real work, and real work deserved real support, and she was tired of important institutions getting shaken by the private failures of the people running them, and she intended to keep giving, and she hoped everyone in the room did too. People applauded. Marcus kept running. Claire spoke briefly. Not because the occasion required it, but because the room did, because there were 60 people who had come on a Saturday because they believed in something, and they deserved to hear, directly and personally, that the belief was not misplaced. She did not prepare remarks. She stood in front of the room and said what was true. She said the foundation's work was real and would continue. She said the people in the room, the parents, the grandparents, the bake sale organizers, the $10 a month donors who never made it into any annual report, were the foundation's actual foundation. She said that institutions were only as strong as the trust of the people who believed in them. And the people in this room had not withdrawn their trust when they had every reason to, and she would spend the rest of her professional life being worthy of it. She did not talk about Daniel. She did not talk about the gala, or the divorce, or the audit, or the legal proceedings. She talked about Marcus, who she described without using his name as a 7-year-old who was currently running around the room and who was alive and running because the work of the foundation was real. Darlene in the third row pressed her hand to her mouth. Patrice at the back of the room was nodding the slow nod of someone, hearing something confirmed that she had known for a long time. When Claire finished, the applause was not the polished, practiced applause of a gala. It was the kind that happened when people forgot they were clapping and just did it because something had moved through them that required expression. She thanked them all. She meant it more than she had meant a professional thank you in years. On her way out, Patrice walked her to the door. Same time next year? Patrice asked. Same time next year, Claire said without hesitation. She drove home through December streets, with the heater running and the radio off, and she thought about the shape of the year behind her and the shape of the year ahead, and she allowed herself carefully, fully, without apology, to feel the difference between them. The Bennett Hart Gala was announced publicly in the 3rd week of December. The press release was drafted by Caroline Marsh and approved by the board and was notable for what it did not contain: no lengthy explanation of the rebranding, no defensive positioning about the foundation's prior governance, no reference to the events of the autumn. It simply announced, clearly and with quiet confidence, that the foundation's primary annual event would henceforth carry the name of the family whose support had made it possible, and that the inaugural Bennett Hart Gala would be held in the spring. The coverage was broader than Claire expected. The story was not, as she had feared it might be, framed primarily through the lens of the divorce. Several of the longer pieces, the thoughtful ones, the ones written by journalists who had done their research, told a different story. They told the story of a foundation rebuilt, of institutional accountability, of a donor community that had held steady through a governance crisis because the relationships at the foundation's core were strong enough to hold. Several of the pieces quoted Helen Argent. "The foundation is stronger now than it was before," Helen said in one of them, "not despite what happened, but because of how it was handled." When an institution faces a genuine governance failure and responds with honesty and accountability rather than cover-up, that builds trust rather than destroying it. "We handled this correctly." The journalist had followed up, "Who is we in that sentence?" Helen's response was characteristically precise: the board, the auditors, the incoming executive director, and the woman whose family built the institutional infrastructure that made all of this possible, who chose to protect the foundation's mission rather than her personal narrative. That's who we is. Claire read this in her office on a Thursday morning with a cup of coffee and a feeling that was not pride exactly. Pride was too simple a word for what it was, but something in the territory of recognition. Being seen accurately, being described correctly, the specific long-denied experience of having the true shape of what you had done reflected back to you without distortion. She had not realized until she felt it how long she had been hungry for it. Caroline called her the same morning the press release went out. The Meridian Health Partnership, Caroline said, they want to expand. They're proposing a 5-year commitment that would fund 3 new surgical positions and a pediatric outreach program in underserved communities. How much? $14 million over 5 years. Claire closed her eyes briefly. $14 million properly deployed was 800 to 1,000 surgeries. It was children who would otherwise not have access, receiving care that would determine the entire trajectory of their lives. What do they need from us? She asked. A formal presentation to their board in January, Caroline said, and they specifically requested that you be present. Then I'll be there, Claire said. There's one more thing, Caroline said, and something in her voice shifted slightly careful. Considered. They also asked whether the foundation would be interested in a formal advisory partnership with the Bennett Family Trust. Not financial. Structural. They want the trust's institutional credibility associated with the foundation formally, not just historically. Claire was quiet for a moment. This was the question Caroline had asked her 60 days earlier, reframed. The 60 days had passed, the audit was closed, the divorce was final. The governance reforms were in place. The moment was different now. Yes, she said, I think that's the right structure. Are you ready for the formal role? I've been doing the work for 12 years, Claire said. I'm ready for the title. Caroline's laugh was short and genuine. Fair enough, she said, let's build something. It was Richard who called her on the last evening of December, just before midnight, when she was at the Ashworth Lane house, her house, the house that was now entirely and unambiguously hers, sitting in the chair by the front window that had always been her favorite reading chair, the one she had chosen 12 years ago when they moved in, and that Daniel had always referred to as her chair, with the faint, affectionate condescension of someone who found the specificity of her preferences slightly charming in a small domestic way. The chair was hers now, too. She was reading when Richard called. Happy almost New Year, he said. Almost, she said. How are you feeling? She thought about this with the full honesty she always tried to give honest questions. Strange, she said. Not bad, just it's a lot to hold in 1 year. It is, he said. Mom used to say that the years that change you the most don't feel like the biggest years when you're in them, Claire said. They feel like the hardest years, the biggest only comes clear later. This one felt both, Richard said. Yes, she said. This one felt both. A comfortable silence, the kind you can only have with someone you have known your entire life. The gala in the spring, Richard said, the Bennett Hart Gala. Are you nervous? A little, she admitted. Why? You've run this event for 11 years. I've run it from behind someone else's name, she said. This is different, better different, he said. Yes, she said. Better different. After she hung up, she sat in the quiet of the house and let the year move through her one more time, not cataloging it, not narrating it, just feeling the full weight and texture of it. The gala and the envelope in Daniel's face when he read the card. The board meeting and the audit and the cafe conversation. The phone call from Olivia, the recognition event, Marcus running between chairs. Margaret producing documents with the patient precision of someone who had spent 40 years building cases and was not done yet. Helen Argent's undeceivable gaze, Patrice's hug at the door, and underneath all of it, the thing she had arrived at not suddenly, not in any single moment, but accumulated across months of process and grief and legal machinery and small, specific acts of honesty, the understanding of what she was when she was not being it for someone else. She was a woman who remembered people's names. She was a woman who read every document she signed. She was a woman who knew that silence was not weakness, and patience was not surrender, and that the most powerful position in any room was the one no one was watching until the moment everything depended on it. She was a Bennett. She was her mother's daughter. She was the woman who had walked into the Grand Bennett ballroom on the night of the gala as someone's quiet, overlooked wife and walked out of it as herself, fully and finally and without apology. The spring gala arrived on a Saturday evening in April, when the city had shed its winter gray and everything was moving again, the way things do in spring, with the specific, renewed energy of life reasserting itself over the long difficulty of winter. The Grand Bennett ballroom had the same chandeliers, the same orchestra, the same caliber of guests, but everything about it was different. The name over the entrance read, the first annual Bennett Hart Gala. Claire arrived not 8 minutes early, not calibrating her entry for anyone else's timeline. She arrived when she arrived, and the guests were already assembled. and the room turned not dramatically, not with any single coordinated movement, but the way rooms turn when someone enters who the room was waiting for without knowing it. Helen Argent was near the entrance. "Ready?" Helen said. "I've been ready," Claire said, "for quite a long time." She walked into the room. She greeted Harold and Rosemary Kaufman, who had flown in from their winter home for the occasion. She greeted the Albrecht family, Harold Albrecht, at 81, still upright and sharp-eyed and present. She greeted Caroline Marsh, who was already in a conversation with the Meridian Health Board chair about the 5-year partnership that had been formally signed in February. She greeted Ellison, who gave her the look of a man who has watched an institution he cares about survive something difficult and is grateful for it. She greeted Patrice, who was there for the first time, wearing a dress that she had mentioned in a text the week before she was nervous about, and who looked, when Claire hugged her, like a woman who had arrived somewhere she hadn't been sure she'd be welcome and was finding that she was more than welcome. "You look wonderful," Claire told her. "I look terrified," Patrice said. "Same thing sometimes," Claire said. Darlene was there with Marcus, who was older now by months and slightly less inclined to run between chairs, though the evening was young. Bryce was there, the young man who had delivered the envelope at the prior year's gala, who had since joined the Foundation's event staff in a role that suited him genuinely, and who had proven, in the months since, to be both capable and deeply committed to the work he had landed in. When the program began, it was Claire who took the microphone, not because anyone had asked her to, not because she needed the stage, not because 12 years of standing behind someone else's name had created a hunger for the spotlight that she now needed to satisfy. She took the microphone because the moment required someone who knew the full story of everything this room represented to stand in it and say so, and she was the person who knew it. She looked out at the room. 450 people, slightly more than the prior year. Faces she knew. Faces she was meeting for the first time, children who were alive because of the work of the institution whose first gala now bore her family's name. She did not perform composure, she was composed because she was. She spoke about her mother first briefly, with precision, with the specific love of a daughter who had spent her adult life understanding better and better what she had been given. She said her mother had built something that was meant to outlast her, and it had, and she intended it to outlast herself as well. She spoke about the Foundation's year, about the audit and the governance reforms and the new leadership and the 5-year Meridian Health Partnership, and what the resources generated by that partnership would mean for children who were waiting. She did not speak about the divorce. She did not speak about Daniel. She did not need to. She spoke about what the room was, which was a room full of people who had chosen to believe in something even when the institution carrying that belief had stumbled, and who had held steady, and whose holding steady had made the recovery possible. "This room," she said, "belongs to all of you. It always has. That's what I want you to know tonight, and what I will spend every year reminding you. The Foundation exists because you exist. The work happens because you fund it. The children are alive because you chose to give," she paused. "That is not decoration. That is not the soft work. That is the entire Foundation. And I am honored and grateful and determined to be its steward." The applause was not the trained, polished applause of an audience that has been positioned to respond. It was the kind that begins before it's finished, that rises without a signal, that says something about people doing it than simply about the person receiving it. Helen Argent, in the front row, was the first on her feet. Patrice, somewhere in the middle of the room, was on her feet before Helen had finished rising. Darlene was standing. Harold Kaufman stood, with the deliberate effort of an older man making a physical statement, and Rosemary stood beside him with her hand through his arm. Claire stood at the microphone and let it happen. She did not look away from it, and she did not minimize it, and she did not perform the modest deflection of a woman who had spent too many years making herself smaller than she was. She received it directly, fully, without apology, because she had earned it, and her mother had earned it, and the institution they had built had earned it. And this room, on this night, was where the truth of that was being said out loud at last. When the applause settled, she said, "Thank you, now let's get to work." Later in the evening, after the program and the dinner and the auction, she found herself standing in almost exactly the spot where she had stood 12 months ago, near the edge of the main room, looking out at the assembled guests. The same chandelier above her, the same orchestra playing, the same architecture of a room that had belonged to her family since before her marriage had existed. Everything else was different. She was different, not in the way of someone who had been broken and rebuilt, not in the language of destruction and recovery that the world sometimes wanted to apply to women who had survived difficult things. She was different in the way of someone who had been compressed by years of smallness and had finally fully expanded back into her own shape. This was her room. It had always been her room. And the woman standing in it, composed, clear-eyed, grieved and grateful in equal measure, carrying the full weight of everything the year had cost and everything it had given, was not the woman behind the success. She was not the quiet partner, the invisible infrastructure, the soft work behind the public face. She was the reason any of it had ever worked at all. She was Claire Bennett. She owned the room. She always had.